In May 2018, a recently elected US President, Donald Trump, made his unmistakable mark on the international stage by unilaterally withdrawing from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal, intended to limit Iran's capability to develop nuclear munitions. Trump's decisive and unorthodox move to exit this deal unilaterally has proved just a taster of the new style of this particular US president. I'm Charlotte Leslie, and I'm the director of the Conservative Middle East Council. The move shocked the world. The deal had not been uncontroversial. Critics pointed out that it did nothing to constrain Iran's ballistic missile capability or its toxic influence through proxies throughout the region, and that an enriched Iran could simply re-embark on its nuclear ambitions in the future thanks to the agreement's sunset clause. But any stability the deal had achieved began to fracture as the US unilaterally withdrew and ramped up pressure on Iran through sanctions. Then on the 22nd of June 2025, under Trump's second presidency, the US launched Operation Midnight Hammer, strikes on key Iranian nuclear facilities in the first US bombardment of Iranian territory since 1988. Today, as we record, many say that the future of the Iranian regime hangs in the balance. The regime has imposed an internet blackout on Iran, so we cannot easily tell how many thousands or tens of thousands of people have been killed as they protest their leadership and fight for freedom. And the world waits to see whether Trump's tough talk does indeed translate into further military action. Here to discuss events in Iran and how we got here, I am joined by two former UK ambassadors whose experience speaks for itself. Nicholas Hopton is a distinguished British diplomat of more than 35 years' experience, and he served as Her Majesty's ambassador to Iran from 2015 to 2018, the first UK ambassador to Tehran since 2011, as well as ambassador to Yemen, Qatar and Libya, and in senior roles across the Foreign Office and Cabinet Office. He's currently director of the Middle East Association. Sir John Jenkins is a retired senior British diplomat, also of a 35-year-long career, including Middle East postings as ambassador to Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Saudi Arabia, as well as consul general in Jerusalem and director for the Middle East and North Africa at the Foreign Office. He is a leading analyst on regional geopolitics and policy. He's taken senior roles in major think tanks and academic institutions such as the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Yale University, Policy Exchange, and Cambridge's Centre for Geopolitics, where his work has addressed strategic challenges from Iran's regional influence. Sir John, Nicholas Hopton, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome. Nicholas, if I could start with you, you were ambassador in Iran, first ambassador since 2011. What did you see in that time, and how has that led us here?
Thank you, Charlotte. The period when I went to Tehran followed immediately on the agreement of the JCPOA and the relaunch of diplomatic relations at ambassadorial level between the UK and Iran after that gap of 4 years following the trashing of the British embassy in Tehran. Now, because of what was happening on the geopolitical stage and the JCPOA, it was a moment of opportunity and, one sense, the possibilities to try and move the relationship, the bilateral relationship between the UK and Iran into a new phase, but also to try and make the JCPOA work by not only constraining Iran's nuclear ambitions, which was the Western purpose of the agreement, but also to help integrate and stabilize Iran within the region and make it a more normal member of the international community. Now, you've described how that unraveled in subsequent years, but in the initial period, at least when I was in Tehran, there was an increase in bilateral and wider engagement with Iran. The Iranian regime clearly behave in a particular way, and I wouldn't want to suggest that they actually changed that behavior fundamentally during the time I'm talking about. But they engaged, in a more positive fashion, perhaps, than had been previously the case, and certainly more positively than has been the case in recent years since the JCPOA unraveled. At the moment, we're back in a phase of high tension and I think high stakes. You describe accurately that we are, since the 28th of December, seeing unprecedented protests in terms of the impact across Iran, also in the numbers of protesters who have been killed during the crackdown by the regime. We don't know the figures, but it seems to be an extraordinary number of people, many of them very young people, who have been killed in these protests. So as the US carrier group, Abraham Lincoln, arrives in the area in these days, tensions rise. We're waiting to see what the White House will do. Will it constrain itself to rhetoric, or will it move to more kinetic pressure on Iran again? And how the regime in Tehran will respond. This is a crucial moment and is likely to affect fundamentally how Iran looks in a few months' time, and certainly in years to come.
Thanks, Nicholas. I'm going to go back to the JCPOA and the merits of it, because to some extent it might have some bearing on what's going to happen next. So, John, can I ask you, can you negotiate with the IRGC? Or is it, as the saying goes, trying to negotiate with a tiger when your head's in its mouth?
I think when you ask about the IRGC, you're fundamentally asking about the nature of the regime in Iraq. And this goes back to the issue of the JCPOA. I think I was a skeptic about the JCPOA from the beginning. I mean, there are this went, and there was a popular argument you could have about the comparative advantages and disadvantages of it. But fundamentally, I think it flowed from a belief that Iran could be made a more normal country within a concert of nations in the Middle East, particularly the Gulf, but not just the Gulf, and form a new security order. And you saw this with Obama's famous appeal to when he said that Saudi Arabia and Iran needed to learn to share the region peacefully. I was in Riyadh at the time when he made it. I can tell you that the Saudis reacted pretty sharply to that. And I think that Iran is fundamentally a lonely state, by choice a lonely state. I mean, if you go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tehran, it has, as you walk in, neither east nor west. Now, you can argue about the tilt to the east over the last decade or so, but fundamentally, by preference, they regard themselves as unique and alone. And it is a non-status quo state. And when I say state, the issue in Iran is that you have what we've seen since 1980, particularly since 1989, when Khamenei becomes supreme leader, the construction of a Praetorian state, which is Khamenei, his office, which is huge, the IRGC and the Basij, were the Praetorian protectors of the regime. And beyond that, you have the 70 to 80% of Iranians who increasingly want something completely different, but cannot get it because every time they go on the streets to want to say they want it, they get shot. So it's not a state in the sense that you see even Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states wanting to become, in the sense that they are states that produce welfare, that provide benefits, services, and the rest of it, and developmental legitimacy. It's a state which is fundamentally ideological and fundamentally destabilizing. And that's my real problem with all of this. And it's an interesting question of what you do. I'm just writing a piece for Engelsberg people about a new security order in the Middle East, ? I think in the end, the Middle East historically has been a region of disorder, not order. I think we're going to see a different sort of disorder. And managing a different sort of disorder is going to require different things, but it's still going to be disorder. And Iran is one of the major elements in this structure of disorder, partly because of its size, and there are 90 million Iranians. There are only a maximum, I think, about 27 million Gulf Arabs. Its massive natural resources, its geostrategic position, all those sort of things do give Iran massive advantages, which this regime has not been able to mobilize because it's been under such economic pressure. But I don't see any, maybe I'm just being pessimistic. I don't see any way in which you integrate Iran under the Islamic Republic into a security order in the Middle East. And that's my basic problem with this.
It was just a few years ago that we were all talking about the Saudi-Iran rapprochement. And Sir John, you're the expert, you're former ambassador to Saudi, but from what I heard, it was a sense that the US was unreliable and therefore other allies in the world had to be sought. They couldn't just rely on the US.
Yeah.
We're seeing the emergence of BRICS as a unit. Is there any sense in which Iran is being integrated into a changing world order as the US takes on a different role?
In the Gulf, I don't think so. I think they have a different view of it. But I think a lot of this is performative, is theatrical. I mean, the Chinese, when the Chinese foreign minister comes and brings together the Saudi and the Iranian sides, and they sign this thing, whenever it was 2-3 years ago, which everybody said this is a reconciliation. Reconciliation doesn't exist in the Middle East. I mean, disputes never get ended by reconciliation. The disputes get postponed until one side is strong enough. It was basically a hedging strategy by Saudi Arabia. They had realized, they'd come to understand, partly because of what had happened in Yemen, but also because of the Iranian-backed strikes on Saudi oil installations that were taken off Suez 6 years ago, that they were very, very vulnerable to hostile action by the Iranians and their friends, allies, and proxies around the region. So they decided to dial down the enmity, which until then had been quite public, because they wanted to get Vision 2030 done. That's the biggest objective for the Saudis. It's economic and social reform within the kingdom. And getting into some sort of fight with the Iranians was always going to be a problem for Vision 2030. So it's hedging. And you've seen it with the Emirates, you've seen it with Qatar, you've seen it with Oman, less so with Bahrain and Kuwait for historical reasons. What you have seen with Iran, and I'd be interested in Nick's views on this, is this turn to Russia and China. And that does seem to me to be interesting and more strategic than anything that happens in the Gulf. And if you're looking at it from Beijing's point of view, the natural resources, I mean, what Beijing has tried to do in Central Asia over the last 20, 30 years has been to construct networks of supply, particularly energy supply, which end in the Middle Kingdom, which end in China, which provide the energy resources on which the Chinese economic model can be built. And Iran has fantastically extensive reserves of both oil and gas, which they've not been able to exploit properly because they've been under sanctions for so long. But if you want to tie Iran into that system, you are tying a massive resource for the Chinese economy into that system. And that, it seems to me, is probably what Beijing is trying to do. The Chinese have been, the foreign minister had been again in the Middle East doing a big tour, and he brought the Saudis and the Iranians together again in some sort of meeting he's been in Jordan and elsewhere. I'm not sure where that ends or how able Iran is to provide the sort of things the Chinese ultimately want over the long term. And there must be people in the Iranian system who are saying, if we built the system on neither East nor West, then it means if we don't like the West, we shouldn't like the East as well. They're looking now. The Russian connection is more tactical. It seems to me they've been providing drone technology to the Russians for the war in Ukraine. The Russians now seem to be able to produce their own drones on the Iranian model, the Shahed model, so they don't need Iran as much as they used to. And Iran and Russia historically have been enemies. But the China thing seems to be interesting.
Well, if I just jump in there, I mean, I agree broadly with all of that, JJ, and I think from the Western point of view, the main objective has been to find, and the Gulf Arabs, it's a question of containment. How do you contain Iran rather than how do you actually integrate it? I think, although there was some optimism that Iran could be brought into a more normal trading relationship, at least with the international community after the JCPOA, that optimism was quickly dispelled, and it didn't take Donald Trump's maximum pressure to show how difficult that was going to be, although ultimately that, of course, killed off that dream for anyone who was still hanging on to it. I think that's the Western perspective at the moment and has been for a while. I think from a historical perspective, of course, Iran is a major international player, not just a regional player. And it would take a different kind of regime than the present Islamic Republic in order to see that Iran retaking a position at the global table, both as a trading and a security contributor, or playing a more positive role. I think we're a long way away from that, whatever happens in the coming months. And the present crises. As for China and Russia, with the Chinese, I always felt that there was a lot of rhetoric, there was a lot of visits and signing of agreements and plans for new railways going across the top of Iran, extensions of the Silk Road and all of this stuff, Belt and Road investment. And there was a lot of that going on when I was in Tehran, and since there's been continued political engagement to that effect. But I'm not sure it's actually led to very much. And I think, yes, obviously the exports of Iran's energy reserves to oil and gas and so forth to China has been valuable for the Chinese. But with the shadow fleet being cracked down on, and with the routes out of Iran for export being brought more under control in this second term of Donald Trump's presidency than was the case under Joe Biden, who effectively tolerated those exports for various reasons, and allowed US sanctions to be ignored to a large extent during the Biden years. But anyway, that's not the case now under Trump, and I think China will be wondering what it gets out of this relationship long term, while carrying a lot of risk by being associated with a country like Iran, which is not only isolated, but in many ways a rogue nation in its security actions across the region, and certainly a disruptor. Which is not in China's interest, because China, like Saudi Arabia, as you described, JJ, under Vision 2030, China at the moment is prioritizing economic development and trade ties and disruptive security activity. Wars in the Middle East do not help. So they will be looking with a degree of skepticism, I imagine, and also wondering where to take their relationship with Iran. And as for the Russians, as you say, it's been a tactical relationship. It's got much closer in recent years as Russia has had to look for support in its Ukraine illegal adventure. And Iran provided that. But I think it's a tactical thing. I always used to joke very wryly with my Russian counterpart when I was in Tehran, who was the most mistrusted on that particular day in Tehran by the authorities. Was it the Russian ambassador or the British ambassador? Nearly always we agreed it was the Russian ambassador. And that is partly due to historical, the relationship where Russia took a large part of Iran's traditional territory, which hasn't been forgotten. The Iranians have long memories, whatever the regime sitting on top of their system. But also because of the way the Russians went about their relationship with Iran, which was essentially a tactical, exploitative relationship, which won't surprise anyone listening, I imagine, because that's how they deal with a lot of things. So the Iranians have been forced closer to Russia, but I don't think they would necessarily see that beyond the regime, which may have no other recourse than to look for some kind of refuge in Moscow at some point. Where else is the supreme leader going to go to if he were to flee the country at some point? But I don't think it's a long-term strategic alliance that will offer Iran security and stability and prosperity. So I think, coming back to where does Iran position itself geopolitically, it wants to see itself not only as a regional player, but also as a geopolitical player, respected by the nations at the top table. And obviously, under this present Iranian Islamic regime, that isn't going to happen. And it's not impossible to see scenarios over time where, under a different type of government in Iran, you could see Iran playing a much more mature role, as I've described, but we're a long way away from that.
I'm Charlotte Leslie, and I'm speaking to former ambassadors Sir John Jenkins and Nicholas Hopton. We've spoken about Iran's place in the world and speaking of it as a lonely country. And we've also talked about one major event in fairly recent history of Donald Trump withdrawing from the JCPOA. Of course, there's another event that changed the world dramatically, which was October the 7th, 2023. To what extent was that major event, that terror attack by Hamas, instrumental in the tectonic shifts we appear to be seeing today? So, John, perhaps I can come to you first on that.
The answer to that is yes, it is. It's massively significant. First of all, it changed the whole nature of politics, I think, within Israel, which had already. I mean, Israel had been shifting to the right since the 1970s, really. Accelerated after 1990 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And if you talk to Israelis now, they will say the majority, something like 80%, that there is no prospect of a Palestinian state. Now, this doesn't mean that is off the table, because of all the other possible solutions to the endemic conflict between Israel and Palestinians. A version of a Palestinian state has to be part of that answer. It just has to be, because it's what all the other regional countries, the Arab countries, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf states, and so forth, want. And unless Israel is going to become a garrison state in perpetuity, sort of behind Jabotinsky's iron wall forever, then at some point there is a deal to be done. But that deal has now been put up way into the future. And the other thing, of course, it shifted was Israel's regional position. I mean, I remember all the conversations before, during, and after the JCPOA about the possibility of destroying Iran's nuclear program by force. And everybody said it's not possible. Now, if you look at what happened last summer, or indeed with Hezbollah in the run-up to that and so forth, with the Israeli action, not just in Gaza, but in Lebanon, and then the Israeli-US attacks on Iran, enormous damage was done to Hezbollah, of course, to Hamas, and a lot of civilians as well in Gaza, and also to Iran, not just the nuclear program, but to its ballistic missile and air defense systems. And this was a country which had constantly threatened Israel with destruction. It made Iran look like a paper tiger. Has Iran's nuclear program been destroyed? I doubt it very much. There's clearly an issue about remaining stocks of enriched uranium and indeed plutonium. There are issues now about the reconstruction of facilities, which the Iranians seem to be going ahead with. But it has certainly set back the nuclear program. And it has raised the possibility of further attacks in the future. And I think it's the other thing it's done, has been to encourage a lot of people in Israel to see themselves as now, invincible is the wrong word, but as hegemonic. And if you talk to people in the Gulf, they will say that the two major threats to them now, they say the two I's. They say Iran and Israel. And they will say we fear Israeli hegemony. And I think some of this is a sort of resurfacing of historic animosity towards Israel. But there are a set of new choices that have arisen because of the aftermath of 7 October 23 in the region about where Israel sits in the region, whether its security in the long term is guaranteed by a security order which involves the Sunni states of the region, and that might include Syria as well, under al-Shara, who is clearly doing his best to find a position between Turkey and Saudi Arabia. And what that means for what Nick was describing in terms of the containment of Iran. I mean, you can't keep Iran down as an expansionist, aggressive power forever. But is there a way of containing Iran which involves a new ordering based on what has happened over the last 3 years in Syria, in Iran, in Gaza, and to a certain extent in Yemen, which provides an opportunity for new diplomacy? I think a lot of this will depend on what happens in Gaza. I think the Board for Peace and the rest of it, I think the objective of rebuilding Gaza is admirable. I think disarming Hamas are extremely low. I think that means it's going to be a real challenge getting anything done in Gaza. But the Americans are, interestingly, deeply committed to driving this forward, at least for the moment. And I think Israel has choices as well. I think Iran clearly has choices in this. And I think a lot of those choices, if you asked ordinary Iranians what they want, they would they do say when they have their demonstrations, when the repeated protests since 2009, They have consistently said, we don't care about Gaza, we don't care about the Palestinians, we want a proper country, we want a proper life, we want decent services. The problem is they're not going to get this under this regime. So you're still left with the problem with the Islamic Republic, and what happens with them. I think to a certain extent that will also depend on what happens when Khamenei goes and the succession to Khamenei. And it's an interesting question of what sort of regime would be minimally acceptable to the neighbours, would an IRGC regime, which is militaristic, authoritarian, but allows social freedoms and does not seek to expand aggressively into the region, be acceptable? And then what's maximally desirable? So I think it's opened a lot of new questions about what the regime is going to look like over the next 20 years. But that does require states in the region to make
Nicholas, I'll ask you to answer the same thing, but if I may just add something else on. Often it's said that the Israel-Palestine issue is a sort of recruiting sergeant for the IRGC. Sir John has said not so much amongst the Iranian people. I'd be interested in your view on that. But certainly in terms of proxies, you've seen the Houthis, obviously funded by Iran, become the major champions for the Palestinian cause and use and weaponize that in their activities. Would it be the case that in a hypothetical world, were the Israel-Palestine issue solved and you had a secure Israeli state and a secure Palestinian state, would that drain the swamp that fuels the IRGC's proxies across the region? And what impact would it have on the Iranians themselves? Or is it really the case, as Sir John says, that they just want a functioning country?
I think it's incredibly complex. When I was living in Tehran, I was struck by a number of things. Iran is an incredibly surprising country to live in. Every day there's something that takes you by surprise. One of them was how secular the country was. I've been diplomat in Paris as well. My daily encounters in Iran suggested a much more secular country and population than the French, who of course pride themselves on their laïcité. That was one regular surprise, and related to this question, how do they view the Palestinian cause and the expansion of the exportation of the Islamic Revolution? I think I was always surprised by how little most Iranians cared about the Palestinians. And it was it was very distant. Two, it was expensive, these foreign adventures in the name of exporting the Islamic Revolution. And the people were much more focused on their daily living standards and the ability to educate and look after their families. So, but it is a very complex country. And as JJ has mentioned, there are around 90 million Iranians in the country itself and many more in the diaspora. So what they all want is far from unified. And I think since the 7th of October, what you've found is that has been a useful tool for the IRGC. They've been able to manipulate that, and they've used their proxies to bring pressure to bear on Israel because of that conflict. And now that they are in a much weaker position and their proxies have been pushed back to a large extent, whether Hezbollah or Hamas or in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, there is a moment, I think, where the IRGC, the regime, will have to take a hard look in the mirror. And given that their main objective is their own survival, above all, that's the Islamic Republic's main objective, survival, they may have to take some hard choices. And what that will lead to, I don't know. I think the West needs to maintain pressure, not only to rebuild Gaza, which prevents a void opening up again, a vacuum which can be filled by disruptive activity, some of it funded by Iran. They need to keep pressure on ensuring that weapons exports to Hezbollah, to Hamas, don't start again, because there are reports that some of that is already happening again, despite what happened last year in the Israeli 12-day war with Iran. I think the West needs to maintain attention and pressure, particularly the United States. So I, like JJ, I mean, although one will have views on whether the border peace is an appropriate body or put together in the right way, but rebuilding Gaza, and if that contributes to it, then that's a positive thing overall. That must be right. But I think we must use this opportunity to also push back on Iran and the IRGC in particular, use of the Al-Quds Force to export disruption in the region. And in particular, I think we need to keep a very weather eye on what is happening in the IRGC itself. So one of the scenarios, perhaps a more likely scenario than the spontaneous breaking out of democracy in Iran, a much more likely scenario is some kind of descent into chaos. We've seen a series of steps over recent years, the 2022 protests following the death of Mahsa Amini, which were crushed. But you can go back in history, there have been protests for a long time against the Islamic Republic. I think the present protests have taken us down to a new level in the death by 1,000 cuts, as JJ and my distinguished colleague Ali Ansari put it. The regime is dying. It's dying by 1,000 cuts. We just don't know whether this is the final cut or not. And I think that's an accurate description of what's happening. But it is quite possible that the forces within the regime, military or otherwise, will choose to impose some sort of martial regime, martial law on the country, a coup from within, maybe removing the theocracy in the name of stabilizing the country. But that will not lead to a better partner for the region or the West. And I think more that we are seeing a descent into chaos, and how we get from where we are now to a position where there is an orderly transition to a better perspective of future for the Iranian people, where they have more say in how they live their lives, where they can be more integrated into the international family. There's a big gap, and I don't think anyone yet has identified how we go from where we are now on the verge of chaos to that more orderly transition and a better future.
I add something to that, Charlotte.
Yeah, please do, Sir John.
And I agree with all of that. One of the problems, so, my guess is 70 to 80%. If you look at, polling is difficult in Iran, but everything we think we know and we see suggests that a vast majority of Iranians want a different regime. Since the Arab Spring, we've seen these headless insurgencies or headless uprisings, acephalous. And they're acephalous for a particular reason, because if you have a leader within the country, they will get picked off. And we've seen this in Iraq with the Tishreen protests in 2019, and we've seen it with the protests in 2009. Of course, what happened in 2009 was that the people who might have become the leaders of the anti-Ahmadinejad and Khamenei movement were instantly put into house arrest. So it's going to be very hard within Iran for any of these protests to produce a consensus on what comes afterwards. And we've seen it outside the country. I mean, he actually was much more president than I ever thought he would be. But I think the chances of him becoming the person who blends, you've got to be in the country to make it happen. If you look back at what happened in the constitutional revolution in Iran is 1905 to 1911. 1905 is demands for an assembly. It's very similar to the sort of things you saw in Turkey, in Ottoman Turkey at the same time with the rise of the Young Turks. You had an assembly movement, a constitutional movement, which produces a constitution, produces an assembly. That assembly is then forcibly prorogued in 1911. You then get a decade of chaos, where bits of Iran try to split off. There are localized insurgencies. There's all sorts of stuff going on. This is ended by Reza Khan's coup of 1921. You get a strong man coming in. And it is interesting if you look at the Pahlavi dynasty, like the Qajars before them, was stigmatized by the Islamic Republic for decades. Now you've got Iranians chanting, "We want the Pahlavis back." Maybe what in an obscure sort of way, this is signaling that in the end, if this system is going to be changed, it's going to be changed by a coup from within the regime. A coup against them, which is actually what we saw in Egypt between 2011 and 2013 as well, where it was, you look back and you think it was essentially a coup by parts of the army against other parts of the security apparatus. My guess is that that's going to. But I think, as Nick said, what we may see in the meantime is a descent into chaos, which is only ended by another intervention by somebody who has the power to impose a new, even if it's an authoritarian system. That's not what I think most Iranians want. I very much hope that democracy and prosperity and all these things could break out. I just don't see how that change happens structurally.
And I guess this feels like one of these podcasts that could be out of date within a matter of days, if not hours, because Donald Trump is, notoriously unpredictable. If the US did something military, unpredicted, like Operation Midnight Hammer, to what extent would that change things? Is that going to create more chaos? Does the US have any remit to assert anyone else from outside? Think Pahlavi. What could happen in the next couple of hours, days, as we sit with this threat or this opportunity, depending on how you look at it, facing us?
Shall I jump in first of all on that one? Is that all right? I think there are a number of scenarios. It's a bit unprecedented, this moment, certainly in terms of US-Iran. People have drawn parallels to what happened in Iraq following 9/11. Some of those parallels, particularly worst-case scenarios, are worth exploring. And, that would be a very bad outcome if you had Iran cast into the kind of turbulence and situation that Iraq was in for over a decade, ongoing, some might say. But there are other scenarios. So I can see a diplomatic scenario emerging this week, and perhaps this is what the White House is hoping for, based on the model that seems to have worked successfully for Venezuela. Possibly one might interpret for Greenland as well. In other words, the now classic Trump playbook of ramping up the rhetoric and the threats and even the military big stick to a very high level on the scale before creating the fluidity out of which a deal can be struck, which moves things forward a little bit in the US interest, but far from the optimal solution that the president had set out initially, or that some people hoped for. So in Venezuela, you've got a regime which looks from outside to be a puppet regime and compliant with the White House's will at this point. But it is still an authoritarian regime where the Venezuelan people have not got what they want. So that could be the kind of thinking going on among some planning what comes next from the US side. Now, would the Iranians play ball on that? Well, if it led to the regime surviving, there would be many within the system who would argue, yes, we should re-engage, do a deal with the US, possibly even move beyond red lines that were previously set out, possibly accede to demands that there should be no enrichment, even for civilian purposes, of uranium within Iran, and that they would have to rely on the Russians and others to help them with their civil nuclear energy and so forth. Previously a red line, but maybe, given the present situation, that might be preferable in the eyes of some around the supreme leader and the powers at the top of the system to the annihilation of the regime, which is a second scenario. Hard to see how that happens because the regime is very embedded. The security forces are very embedded. We've seen actually how they have acted in the last few weeks over a 2-day period, having cut off the internet and cut Iran off from the world. They crushed the protests. And it's only now, since the VPNs have been active again in the last few days, I've been receiving messages from inside Iran without detail. Nobody knows the real detail, but uniformly, whether you're talking to people in Yazd, Tehran, Shiraz, Esfahan, Tabriz, they all say it's been terrible. It will emerge in due course now, and some doctors are reporting from their networks within Iran, Iranian doctors working in the hospitals, that upwards of 25,000 may have been killed. This is unprecedented levels of killing since the 1979 revolution. So a military option is not straightforward because the security have everything to lose. The regime has everything to lose if they go to war with the US. it doesn't necessarily produce a clean outcome either, as I've said, because the Iraq scenario is in the back of all of our minds when boots are put on the ground in a country like this. And subject to JJ disagreeing with this, as a former ambassador in Iraq, he will know better than me. But my sense is that Iran is probably a more complex country than Iraq when it comes down to it, so even more difficult to subjugate and move forward. There are other scenarios. One would hope that there will be enough sane voices in the regime to walk the supreme leader and other decision makers back from the brink, which would push everything more into chaos, more people being killed. There are voices off stage, and people will have seen in the last days demonstrations, protests in London, large numbers of people marching through the streets. I saw a demonstration over the weekend where there were many people from the diaspora, but also others marching, and the unified chant was surprisingly all about Reza Pahlavi and freedom for Iran in a way that we didn't see after the 2022 protests started. I think a lot of Iranians have come to the conclusion, whether inside or outside the country, that they don't want Reza Pahlavi necessarily. They certainly don't want him as Shah and ruler. But if he could play some sort of role in helping to make more orderly a transition period following a change from the present regime, that would be preferable to what they've got at the moment. And it's quite interesting talking to Iranian friends and people outside the country. They will often preface their remarks by, of course, I don't want Reza Pahlavi, I don't like him, or I don't respect him, or whatever. But and then they will go on to explain why actually that may be the best option at the moment to aim for. Because as JJ said, there is no unifying figure within the system, the opposition to the system, who has emerged as yet, and the most prominent is Reza Pahlavi. So there are various scenarios that could play out at the moment. None of them are smooth, none of them are optimal, but a lot will depend on what degree the US is prepared to go to with not only wielding the big stick, but then trying to decapitate the regime perhaps, or even go further with the use of military power.
I think the Americans could certainly, if they wanted to, they could certainly take out IRGC headquarters. They could take, not just in Tehran, but around the country. They could do a lot of damage to the regime's surveillance technology, but they can't destroy it all. And I think one of the things that this regime has done over the last 30 years is build in redundancy into the system, into the security elements of the system, and that gives it huge resilience. I think Nick is absolutely right about Iraq. I mean, Iraq is a much less sophisticated country and complex country than Iraq. And I remember speaking to a very distinguished Iranian academic at Berkeley in the US, and I asked him what was the difference between these popular protests in Iran and those in Iraq. And he said the difference is memory. He said Iranians remember a time before the Islamic Republic. They remember a time when there was a sort of democratic facade. And they also remember a time actually before Islam. And that's also part of if you look at the Iranian Twitter, a lot of it is also about the pre-Islamic, about Cyrus the Great, Dariush, this sense of a cultural distinctiveness and a sense of cultural, historical, and political sophistication, which they don't see in the rest of the Middle East. Now, some of that is Iranian chauvinism, but there is a point to this. And I think, if you were going to get a happy ending to this, you would need to find a solution that provides for the expression of the political will of all Iranians, which means some sort of national process to produce a new system. Is that going to happen? Doubt it. But if you were going to make an offer to the current Iranian regime, which is not itself, but it is very powerful and very solid, but there will be different voices within it, then it seems to me that something like that has to be a part of the demand. You need to find a way to give ordinary Iranians a voice in the sort of regime that follows this one.
Finally, I'm going to finish off a fascinating discussion about complexity with a very simple binary question. And the reason I'm asking it is because it's one that is constantly raised and asked in Parliament and in UK politics as we struggle to navigate what we do about this situation. And the question is, should we prescribe the IRGC? I'll come to. So John, you wrote the report on the Muslim Brotherhood, and you have a long history in political Islam. So
the IRGC is a lot of different things. I mean, like Hezbollah, it's currently apparatus within Iran. It's an expeditionary arm of the radical Islamic Republic. It's a massive economic actor within Iran. Through Hopton, which is the sort of massive holding company, which expanded particularly under Ahmadinejad. So when people say, you're prescribing the armed forces, well, you're not actually. I mean, personally, I don't see any downside. A lot of people do. I think the minimum we should do is look very closely. As Jonathan Hall, who is the very distinguished KC, who is the independent advisor on terrorism legislation in this country, has suggested we should look very hard at what the IRGC are doing here through various agencies, Islamic human rights, seeking to undermine or to influence British politics, and start with that. And you can do that through an inventive use of existing terror legislation if you didn't want to prescribe the IRGC as a whole. I think you also need to look at the money. I think if you look at a lot of what the networks that the IRGC has constructed in the region, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and so forth, are doing is illicit use of money. And I think in general, when we're looking at Islamists, to follow the money. I think incidentally, Nick mentioned Venezuela. I think the Venezuela thing is very, very significant for Iran, because the connection between Iran and Venezuela, and indeed further down into South America, into the Clyde border area, has been very, very significant as an external lung for the Iranian regime, and a means to put pressure on the United States. And that actually is a step you can take, which actually weakens the IGC. So we should certainly be looking at weakening it.
Nicholas Hopton.
Well, I agree with JJ that the objective should be to weaken the IRGC, and ideally to do that without weakening the United Kingdom at the same time. And the argument that has often been put forward in the past against prescribing the IRGC has been that by doing that, it would be a very blunt instrument, not smart in the way that a lot of sanctions these days try to be. It'd be a very blunt instrument, and effectively you would be prescribing the national army of the Islamic Republic, and actually you would be not able to do it under the current British legislation, which doesn't allow you to do that. Now, that all feels a little bit passé, and almost as if we are in a new situation at the moment, where we've got to look with fresh eyes and more creativity at what is required to achieve UK national interests, and part of that being, of course, supporting the upholding of human rights and the ability of people inside Iran to express their opinions and move for a better future. We seem between a rock and a hard place. So the government seems to be falling back on the line at the moment that the legislation wouldn't allow it to happen. But I agree with John Hall, JJ's point, that we should be focusing particularly on what the IRGC does through its own people and others in the UK and in other countries which are of great interest to UK interests. That should be our primary purpose. But we may have to conclude that actually we're in a new situation now as regards the Islamic Republic, and it is irrelevant whether the result of changing our legislation, perhaps if necessary, and then prescribing the IRGC would then lead to the breakdown in diplomatic relations between Iran and the UK. Is how valuable are those relations nowadays, as opposed to a time, say, when we were trying to build something different after the JCPOA. This is a new time. This is a new phase, and will history judge us and our partners badly in the future if people will look back in 10 years' time and say, you didn't do enough and you should have prescribed? So I don't have the simple answer, I'm afraid, Charlotte, but I do think that we need to be prepared to look with fresh eyes at this question, and that includes the institutions within the British government, and that's going to be a challenge, because we all get used to seeing questions such as how do we engage with Iran in a certain way. We're in a new phase. I think we need to understand that, and we need to be prepared to look clear-eyed and with a fresh approach if necessary.
You've been listening to CMEX podcast. I'm Charlotte Leslie, and we've had the privilege of speaking to Nicholas Hopton and Sir John Jenkins. Nicholas, John, thank you very, very much for your time and taking us through what is a dynamic and incredibly complex area. So thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.